It's time again for another episode of Weird and Wonderful, the series where I take a look at some of the most bizarre toys ever released. And this week I thought I'd turn my attention to the likeness. Because when you're making a toy that is based on a very popular franchise or property, it might be a film, it might be a comic book, a TV series, an animated series, there's an automatic built-in expectation that that toy is going to look like the source material. Yes, there's usually a degree of latitude when it comes to creative license to do something slightly different, because after all it is a toy, so you can let your imagination fly a little bit, but there's a few basic things that have to match the core character, and the key one essentially has to be the likeness. Very often it is the sculpting that is the make or break of one of these toys, because if the face isn't right, then doesn't matter how great the rest of the figure is, you're always going to be disappointed. And I have to say, as I was researching all the ones that went wrong, all those mistakes, all those really poor likenesses, I was actually spoilt for choice because there's so many out there. But nevertheless, I have condensed it down to my top 10 personal favourites. So without further ado, let's take a look at number 10. Okay, at number 10, this might surprise a few people, but I have the Quantum Mechanics or QMX Captain Kirk. Now, let me start by saying that this isn't the worst figure in the world. It's not even the worst Captain Kirk figure. On the contrary, QMX specialised in creating really highly detailed, very lovingly applied costumes, accessories, stands, and head sculpts for their action figures, especially in the Star Trek line. And if we take a look at their Mr. Spock, for example, we can see that the likeness here is pretty phenomenal. What an amazing head sculpt that this is. This looks really pitch perfect. Like it's almost uncanny. This looks just like Leonard Nimoy. It's incredible. So what the hell happened to Captain Kirk? Poor William Shatner. Now, again, this isn't an absolutely dire head sculpt, but let's look at it closely. Again, these are very expensive figures. We've seen some of the great work they can do with other figures in the line. And then we have the Captain Kirk, one of the most important characters in all of Star Trek history and lore. And this likeness, just sadly, it just isn't there. And don't get me wrong, there is a look. I think they've done a good job of the hair, but if we look at the eyes, they're far too squinted and narrow. The nose seems a little bit too broad and short, and overall the symmetry of the face just doesn't look quite right. And ultimately, for a high-end collectible like this, which costs several hundreds of pounds, then really you've got to nail that likeness. It's got to be spot on. And sadly, it just isn't. It's ever so slightly off, and it just throws the whole look off kilter. Okay, next up I have the Movie Maniacs Corporal Hicks figure from McFarlane Toys. Now I should point out that by this point in the history of McFarlane Toys, they'd established a pretty good reputation for delivering fantastic sculpts and realistic poses and action figures for the adult collector. More often than not, these figures would have fantastic detailing, wonderful paint apps, realistic sculpts, but didn't have so much in the way of articulation. There was definitely a trade-off between aesthetic and articulation schemes, and they opted to go for the former, and of course, it paid dividends. So what happened with Corporal Hicks? The other figures in this line included Aliens, Predators, they did Terminator figures, and they were all pretty solid likenesses and fantastic sculpts, but poor Hicks here didn't get the same treatment somehow. For starters, his frame is far too big and bulky and hyper-masculine. This is quite an exaggerated version of Hicks than we see in the actual film. And then, of course, we have the head sculpt, the likeness itself, and wow, yeah, I mean, this looks nothing like the actor Michael Biehn. I'm honestly not sure what happened here, whether there was some sort of issues in terms of getting the likeness signed off, but this just doesn't look anything like him. And that's absolutely fine if you're happy with a generic soldier to add to your Colonial Marines, but if you want one of the main heroes of that film, then you're out of luck. Okay, so we've had a couple of warm-ups, but this is where things start to get quite awful. Now, on the face of it, the Independence Day toys from toy company Trendmasters, can't say I'm that familiar with that brand, but I did own a few of these when I was a kid, were pretty cool. It was quite a broad line, actually crossing a couple of different scales that had playsets and vehicles, and pretty much all the major characters from the film, and a healthy assortment of aliens. And those aliens, for the most part, were pretty solid. They were very good likenesses, quite nicely articulated, and they'd usually come with a rubber mini alien along with the figure, although very often when you opened up the main case you'd have this rather strange cardboard cutout. And for some reason, each figure was packed with a floppy disk that I think was part of a game, and I think you had to collect them all to be able to play the game. I can't quite remember. Quite a strange novelty idea for the time, but it did seem kind of cool. Now then, so far, so good. So why are they on this list? Well, whilst things were pretty good for the alien figures, the human characters, not so much. And I think the worst offender is the Stephen Hillier, or the character played by Will Smith. The likeness on this figure bears very little resemblance to Will Smith. Once again, he's a victim of that trend in the 90s to really bulk up their heroes in their action figure form to make them a lot beefier than they appear in the source material. And of course, the likeness itself, the portrait here, is just very, very off. The shape and size of the head is just completely in the wrong proportions. And honestly, I challenge you, take this figure, show a friend, and ask them who it's meant to be, and I can pretty much guarantee no one will say Will Smith. Okay, so far we've seen toys that have just missed the mark. The likenesses have just been ever so slightly off. There is the feeling that this has been unintentional. They've been trying their best, but they just haven't got it right with the sculpts. However, there are examples when a toy company will deliberately make changes because what they have on screen or in the source material doesn't quite fit with the toy that they want to produce, so they will be quite liberal with the changes they make. And a really good example of this is the classic Jurassic Park line. For the most part, a lot of their human characters were fairly faithful to what you see on screen, but then you'd have examples like Dennis Nedry. Now, I think it's fair to say that the actor who plays the character on screen is quite a large fellow, and probably isn't the easiest character to market to children. At the end of the day, he's a fairly unpleasant character in the film. He has very limited screen time in all truth, and obviously meets a very gruesome end. All this no doubt combined with the aesthetic of the time when it came to action figures of that much more bulky, heroic, hyper-masculine form that we'd see in action figures didn't really sit well with this much bigger, much more rotund character. So they made the creative decision to reimagine the character as an action hero. But Nedry was by no means an exception, because although we did get a pretty faithful screen accurate version of Ian Malcolm pretty early in the line's run, as time went on, the line got a little bit more creative, i.e. trying to resell the same characters over and over again and trying to put a new twist on them to make them feel fresh and new and appealing. And when they do this, this is usually when they start introducing radical reinterpretations of characters, which is how we got the Chaos Effect wave. And by contrast, we have a figure that looks nothing like Jeff Goldblum, who wears the absolute antithesis of his costume in the film. Gone are the dowdy black colours, now we have luminous yellow and some sort of strange contraption which goes over him and acts as some sort of missile firing grabbing arm. From my perspective, everything about this figure is awful. It's just not visually appealing, it just feels a little bit over the top, it looks nothing like the character it's meant to be, it just fails on pretty much every front. Wow, if ever there was a franchise that had toy appeal built in, it was going to be Mission Impossible. These are made for action figures with all the gadgets, the interesting characters, the elaborate fight and stunt sequences, the vehicles, the playsets you could do. The possibilities are endless, and I'm betting that's what toy company Tradewinds thought as well. When they picked up the license for the first film all the way back in the very early 90s, they must have thought they'd hit gold. No other toy company had managed to get their hands on a license. They had something that was akin to James Bond, and the potential for the success of both the film and the toy line were absolutely huge. However, there's a couple of things they hadn't banked on. First of all, the film wasn't actually well received. Despite going on to have many successful sequels, the initial film didn't really connect with audiences, and it took a couple of films before they found their pace. But to make matters worse is that Tom Cruise famously does not sign away likeness rights. Therefore, Tradewinds was stuck with the rather unfortunate proposition of having a franchise in the hand that wasn't super successful and not even really being able to capitalise on it because they couldn't make a figure that looked anything like Tom Cruise, despite their best efforts. And oddly, rather than exploring some of the other characters in the film, or perhaps inventing a few of their own, they instead decided to dedicate the entire line to Ethan Hunt figures, so it's essentially the same figure, more or less, reissued with different paint apps and accessories. And despite being quite a short-lived line, they managed to go from fairly faithful to the source material, despite having a very strange portrait on the figure, to the most outlandish and bizarre ideas. Okay, so we're really starting to burrow further into the rabbit hole now. Next, we have the Sheriff of Nottingham from Robin Hood, Prince of Thieves. Now, this was a pretty brief toy line with just the one wave. It was, of course, just to tie in with the film, and with hindsight, it might seem like a pretty odd decision to launch a toy line with this particular film, but if we think about it, Kenner had had enormous success with film properties that seemed unmarketable to children. Obviously, we saw the great success with Jurassic Park, but they also had things like Terminator and Aliens. But there was a lot less effort put into this Robin Hood line. So much so, in fact, that they actually decided to just recycle a lot of their Star Wars figures and try to make them fit the Robin Hood wrapping. And yeah, it wasn't entirely successful. There's not many great figures in this line. In fact, there's not many good figures in this line. But undoubtedly, the one figure that fares the worst, that suffers the most, has to be the Sheriff of Nottingham. They've done quite an exceptionally bad job here, especially when it comes to this head sculptor. Obviously, this looks nothing like Alan Rickman and has clearly just been repurposed and not remotely successfully. This is pretty horrible on all fronts, really, and I think, it speaks for itself. Certainly, a lot of these figures were very clunky. We can even look at Robin Hood himself, but even with Robin, we can see that at least he does have a look of Kevin Costner. There's actually something approaching decent about the likeness there, although the body is pretty horrible and just looks completely out of proportion. But yeah, the Sheriff of Nottingham figure, poor Alan Rickman, this is hideous. So, sticking with 90s movie tie-ins, next up we have the Hook line, and this is pretty famous because it does reach and surpass even Sheriff of Nottingham standards when it comes to likeness. And this is a little bit surprising because this is coming from toy company Mattel, who generally speaking don't like to take an awful lot of risks, and obviously on the face of it, mixing Robin Williams and Peter Pan just seems like easy money. This thing would surely sell, and maybe that was the problem. Maybe that was the attitude behind the scenes, that maybe they didn't have to put that much effort in because it was going to sell no matter what. But sadly, the end result is pretty horrific. These are not good quality toys, and the likeness is just appalling. And I don't know what happened here. Was there a sculptor's strike? Was there some sort of weird legal clause? Or did just nobody care enough to make sure that they got a decent product out? Surely it can't be that, but I'd love to know what the thinking was behind this line. Such a shame, and an absolute travesty. It really is. Okay, so let's fast forward now to the late 2000s. and to a toy company that really ought to know better. Because of course we do have the McFarlane's Toys Walking Dead figures. Now, these are produced in a much smaller scale than perhaps McFarlane Toys were used to working with at this period in time, but surely there can be no excusing their Rick Grimes. In fact, they released quite a few Rick Grimes figures over the years, and it took them at least 3 or 4 releases before they started to get anywhere near close to producing a decent likeness of Andrew Lincoln. Depending on which version of the figure you're looking at, you could be looking at John Travolta, or you could be looking at a young Robert De Niro from Taxi Driver. And for a company that's made its name on excellent sculpts, this is really surprising. Getting into the truly bizarre now with this figure of Jerry Lane from World War Z. Now, this figure is based on the film starring Brad Pitt. Now, this is from toy company Jazzwares. I gotta be honest, I'm not familiar with that toy company at all, so I've absolutely no idea if this is their usual standard, but this is not a good ambassador for this toy company. I mean, this figure bears little to almost no resemblance to Brad Pitt's character in that film. In fact, it's so bad, it's like they're almost going out of their way not to even try. I mean, he doesn't even have long hair. It's not even blonde. And that's before we get into the actual sculpting itself. And I've seen photos of this figure where, honestly, the eyes look cross-eyed, so the paint apps are pretty awful. The expression on the face, well, I can't decide if he's angry or constipated or both. But there's no doubt that this is pretty awful. This doesn't look like a good toy, full stop. This is a horrific likeness, especially when we think this is meant to represent Brad Pitt, one of the biggest movie stars in the world. It's quite astonishing, especially when you think that at some point, somewhere, someone had to sign off on this. Okay, so at number 1, it might surprise you, but I have to have Han Solo from Return of the Jedi, and specifically from Jabba's palace when he comes out the carbonite. Okay, we've seen quite a lot of bad likenesses in this video. Why is this one the worst in my opinion? Well, let's take a moment to actually compare the figure to an image of Harrison Ford in Return of the Jedi. They look absolutely nothing alike. Now, everything about this is pretty awful. For a start, the head sculpt is gigantic. He's got virtually no neck, but this giant bulbous head, which is pretty unpleasant looking. To make matters worse, there's next to no paint application here at all, apart from the brown that is meant to be his hair. and that's pretty much it with that nasty plastic flesh tone that we've got, which doesn't do him any favours whatsoever. This looks pretty awful. But the bad likeness itself isn't the most surprising thing about this figure. For me, what's really surprising about it is that, well, they'd had plenty of experience of sculpting Han Solo figures since the first film in 1977. Kenner were right there at the beginning, and certainly I think they had to find their way. I don't believe they ever really nailed a really good Han Solo sculpt, at least not in this 3 3/4 scale. But this is the worst, and let's be honest, they should be getting better, not worse over time. And it's not like you can accuse them of being low effort, because this was a pretty invested toy line. It's one of the biggest sellers where they put everything into it in terms of building all kinds of play sets and vehicles and expanding their figure sets out as much as possible. So it's shocking to me that they didn't put more effort into the Han Solo figure, because he's one of the most popular characters. So of all the characters you need to work on the most, it's got to be Han, Luke and Leia. These are the ones that you need to make sure are your best, because these are the ones you're going to sell again and again and again. And I don't understand how they could possibly greenlight this sculpt. Okay, I've complained long enough today and taken up enough of your time. Thank you for watching the video. As always, please do give it a like. Let me know your thoughts in the comments. Were there any that I missed that I maybe should have included in my top 10? I'd love to hear what your personal favourite worst likenesses are. Until next time, see you around.